We have with us today Dr. Masood Raja, author of The Religious Right and the Talibanization of America, that came out last year in 2016, Constructing Pakistan, Oxford 2010. Dr. Raja is the Associate Professor at University of North Texas. He specializes in postcolonial studies, globalization theory, and the study of Islamic cultures and politics. His critical essays have been published in various journals such as the South Asian Review, Caribbean Studies, South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, Prose Studies, Mosaic, Radical Teacher, and others. Dr. Raja has also co-edited 2 collections of essays served on the PMLA Advisory Committee and has recently won and finished administering a $1 million Department of State grant as the director of UNT-NUML Partnership, a 3-year cooperative agreement between UNT and National University of Modern Languages, Pakistan. He's currently working on his next book, entitled Democratic Criticism, Poetics of Incitement and the Muslim Sacred. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Raja, tell us about your thoughts on the current status of postcolonial studies as you see it in the present times.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's really a hard question to answer. But I think a lot of people have been saying since the recent elections in the United States that somehow postcolonial studies is in a crisis because of our focus on questions of identity, that maybe it's no longer needed. But I think more and more in the current climate of global politics and regional politics, there is more need of what postcolonial studies does. And what it does is it questions issues of cultural identity, global economics, neoliberalism, distribution of global resources, and now more also on the lines of environmental protections and eco-criticism. So in my view, my prognosis of post-colonial studies in all its different broad fields is actually, my prognosis is very positive. I think more and more we will need scholars who study not just the old impact of old imperial powers and old colonial histories, but also the impact of current regime of neoliberalism on the global periphery as well as the nations of the metropolitan West.
And related to that, how do you situate postcolonial Pakistan in the larger realm of postcolonial studies?
That's really another interesting question, because I've been visiting Pakistan more frequently in the last 3 or 4 years. And in pretty much all the English departments at universities in Pakistan, postcolonial studies is now taught as at least a course, if not as a subject. And a lot of research that's coming out is also on one or the other postcolonial themes. I think my problem with postcolonial studies as being practiced in Pakistan primarily is that in one way, a lot of work that's being done has become very nativist. And somehow there is this belief that in order to do good work in postcolonial studies or literary studies, there is no need to know the Western canon or the American lit canon, and that somehow scholars can just write from their own lived experience based on the texts that are locally available. And I think that's a disservice to postcolonial studies, because to me personally, postcolonial studies is so expansive, because in order to be a good postcolonialist, you don't only need to know the text of your region that you study, but you also need to know the mainstream canon. Only then you know where to place your argument, where to start your discussion. And in Pakistan, I would like to see more of a hybrid post-colonial studies where focus is on Pakistani culture and literature being produced in Pakistan, but where scholars are not afraid of placing it within the larger global context.
Your book, The Religious Right and the Talibanization of America, came out last year. It's a really intriguing title, The Talibanization of America. Tell us about this book and what it entails in doing.
So, what I was trying to inquire in this book was that whenever you hear about the Taliban, or Islamic fundamentalism, especially in America, there is this pre-assumed idea that somehow Taliban are irrational and something like that could never exist within United States. So what I planned to study was, first of all, in one chapter, what constitutes Taliban, what narratives do they use to justify their actions and themselves. And so I saw this surprising coincidence or these similarities between the rhetoric of the Taliban and the rhetoric of the American extreme right, because both these groups tend to be literalist in their reading of the sacred text. Both groups believe that if their version of the sacred text were to be implemented, Pakistan or Afghanistan would become a better place. Similarly, the American ultra-right believes that if biblical law was to be implemented, America would become a great place. So what I wanted to study was that what kind of a world would these people create if they had the absolute freedom to put into practice their religious beliefs, which the Taliban did get in Afghanistan, and we saw that they created kind of a death world. But somehow there is a belief that if biblical law is implemented in the United States, the result won't be the same. And I think that's a misconception, because what saves, let's say, United States from ultimate Talibanization is not necessarily because Bible is more of a liberal text, but because there is a very strong civic culture. There is a constitution, and there are civic structures which will not permit you to do certain things, regardless of how literalist you are in your approach. So if you take away that civic imperative, which tells the religious groups that there are certain places you cannot go, there are certain things you cannot do. If you take that civic imperative away, which I call a civic imperative, then the ultra-right in the United States will end up creating the same kind of destructive world that the Taliban created. So that was my ultimate conclusion. And of course, in the process of proving that, I read both strains of American ultra-right. I read the religious right and then also the libertarian right. And then I point out, especially in libertarian right, of their misreading of Locke and the question of rights and property rights, their misreading of even Adam Smith. And to my own surprise, I learned that the very people who cite Adam Smith and the idea of a free market being the ultimate corrective in our actions, they don't read his chapter on labor. Because, if they read his chapter on labor, they would realize that Adam Smith points out that what are the inequalities when labor and those who own capital, when they collide, because those who own capital always have an advantage. So all of these things were, I wrote them into my discussion, but the ultimate point was to suggest that without strong civic structures and the Constitution of United States and that civic imperative, the American ultra-right will end up creating the same kind of death world that we saw Taliban create in Afghanistan. That's the only difference between the two groups, I think.
Given your training, experience, teaching, and research in the area of postcolonial studies, tell us what you think is shifting in the field. We talked about earlier what the present field is like, but what is the future in the way it is shifting in certain kind of theoretical paradigms? Where do you see it going?
Well, if you look at the history of postcolonialism as a field of study within the English departments, there never was a stable field. It always depended on who you studied with, which scholars or philosophers you followed, and that would define what you meant by postcolonial studies. So if you came from Berkeley or Cornell, your approach to postcolonial studies was different. Now, if you read Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Spivak, then your approach to postcolonial studies would be different. But if you read Robert Young and other materialist leftist readings of the history of colonization, so already the field could not necessarily be called either post-structuralist or just Marxist, because it was a combination of all, and then there was a huge aestheticist strain in it too. So, and I think that's what made postcolonialism such a formidable field of study, because you could bring your native knowledge, you could acquire metropolitan knowledges and philosophical knowledge, and you could bring the two together to critique power or to critique global inequalities. So now I think increasingly with the rise of, let's say, the Italian Marxism, the autonomous Marxist or workerist Marxist, there is a need that post-colonial studies should take into account, what's coming from that, from Carlo Vercellone or Franco Berardi and these people. What are they theorizing about the current digital labor that they also call cognitariat? And post-colonial studies needs to incorporate that in its own undertaking. Furthermore, I think post-colonial studies also needs to focus more on neoliberalism and globalization and what happens to literary texts in that, and how to teach literary texts, liberatory texts, in the metropolitan cultures, but also in the former colonies with that knowledge of globalization and neoliberalism in mind. So for me personally, since I do work on political Islam, I also feel that there is a need now, because of the refugee crisis and rise of Islamophobia both in Europe and United States, there is also a need in post-colonial studies for scholars to actually study political Islam, issues of migration, immigration, but also issues of representation. Why is it that in so many developed nations, in so many European liberal countries, it's very easy to stereotype Muslims or issue blanket statements about them without much critique of those statements? And I think that's another rich field where the younger scholars can go into and bring post-colonial studies and the tools that it provides to the study of migrancy, but particularly Muslim migrancy within Europe and United States.
I think this ties up with the final question. Tell us about your future projects, and I think you lined up a couple of books that are coming out, so could you please tell us something about
I'm currently working on two book projects. One is a finished manuscript which is being considered by a publisher, and that the title you already mentioned in my introduction, that's Democratic Criticism, Poetics of Incitement and the Muslim Sacred. And that book, actually, I've been working on it for about 5 years, and it sees its beginning point, the Rushdie affair, the publication of the Satanic Verses, and the response to its publication both within the Islamic world as well as in the metropolitan West. And so what I'm trying to insist in this book is that increasingly, while we teach literature and literary texts about Islam in our classes in the United States as well as in Europe, we are not required, the scholars themselves or their students, to learn at least the basics of the meaning-making processes within Islamic cultures. So what ends up happening is we reduce these cultural representations to a sort of a westernized reading of these texts. So just as it's impossible for me to read any American novel without knowing the cultural and historical context of that novel, what I'm suggesting is that we cannot teach literatures of the Islamic world without at least a basic knowledge of Islamic history, Islamic philosophy, and the historical context within which a novel is produced. So democratic criticism kind of enables the readers to at least understand the basic concepts that are absolutely necessary for any scholar to master before they either teach or write about literary texts that either write about Islam or draw on Islamic raw materials. The other book project is also under consideration by another publisher, is a book on ISIS. I know there are a lot of books on ISIS, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to read ISIS as an ideological organization. So a part of me, the project is defining what do I mean by ideology, and then seeing, how does ISIS construct its ideology, but also what narratives does it mobilize to perpetuate itself. And I think what makes the book unique is because I'm actually reading the texts produced by ISIS themselves. So the journal Al-Dabiq that they published, about 12 issues of. Al-Rumiyya is another journal that they publish. Then there is a book which in Arabic is called Idaratul Tawahish, which means a management of savagery. These are the core texts that ISIS leadership uses to define itself. I think understanding these texts and the ideology behind it is crucial in understanding not just ISIS as an organization, but ISIS as an ideological phenomenon. And so that's what I'm trying to do in that book.
Thank you very much for being with us today.